At 8:07 a.m. over the steaming coastline of New Guinea, a silver P-38 Lightning snapped into a turn that should have been impossible. The Japanese Zero that had been sliding confidently toward its tail suddenly found itself overshot. In less than 2 seconds the American twin-engine fighter rolled, bit into the turn, and brought its guns to bear. The Zero pilot never had time to understand what went wrong. 450s and a 20mm cannon lit up. Tracers stitched across the Zero's fuselage. The Japanese fighter burst into flame and tumbled toward the jungle canopy. In the cockpit of that P-38, a 23-year-old American lieutenant named Jack Harris stared in disbelief at his own hands on the control column. "This isn't my airplane," he thought. "This thing never turned like this before." He did not know that the difference between life and death that morning was a scrap of wire, 6 inches long, hidden deep inside his left wing. Welcome to War-Era Records. Today, you and I are going back to the Pacific, 1943, to follow the story of a man you will not find in most history books. Not an ace, not a general, not a famous test pilot. A mechanic. A man with grease under his nails, who broke the rules, risked his career, and quietly rewired how American fighters were flown in the Southwest Pacific. This is the story of a Lightning that learned to turn, the Zero pilots who suddenly lost their edge, and the improvised fix that never made it into the official war stories. Stay with me to the end, because the way this innovation spreads, and what happens after the war, says a lot about how real change actually happens in combat. Scene 1, the airfield that smelled like fear. 2 months before that impossible turn in the sky, Sergeant Daniel "Danny" McGill was standing under the wing of a P-38 at a half-finished dirt airstrip carved out of the New Guinea jungle. The place was little more than a scar in the trees. Canvas tents. Oil drums. Steel Marsden matting hammered down on red mud. Heat that wrapped around you like a wet blanket. The air smelled like 3 things all the time: fuel, hot metal, and nervous sweat. McGill was a crew chief. 26 years old. Before the war he had tuned carburetors in a shabby garage in San Diego. Now he tuned engines that went to war every morning. He knew the Lightning by heart. Twin Allison engines. Counter-rotating props. The strange twin boom tail that made it look alien compared to the sleek Japanese Zeros. He loved the airplane, but he also knew one cold fact every pilot in New Guinea whispered about. The P-38 was lethal in a dive. It could climb like a homesick angel. It carried heavy guns in the nose. At high speed it could outrun and outgun almost anything. But in a turning fight with a Zero at medium altitude and combat speed, it was a coffin with wings. The Japanese Mitsubishi A6M was lighter, slower in a straight line, but incredibly agile. It could bank, roll and snap turn in a way the heavy American fighter simply could not match on paper. American pilots were taught very clear rules. Do not dogfight Zeros. Do not get sucked into a flat turn. Use your speed, your climb, your firepower. Hit once, then disappear. Simple on the chalkboard. Almost impossible in the blur of real combat. McGill had watched those rules break down again and again. He knew it because he watched the beds in the tent city go empty one by one. Scene 2, the pattern of death. The first pilot he really felt responsible for was Second Lieutenant Carl Benson. Benson was a kid from Ohio who talked about dairy farms and snowstorms while McGill checked his fuel lines. He had been in theater 3 weeks. On one mission, Benson limped back with holes in his left boom, white-faced and shaking. In the debrief tent he said something that made McGill's stomach twist. "I did what they told us," Benson said. "I rolled and dove. But when I slammed the stick over, it felt like the airplane took a breath before it listened. Like there was this half-second where nothing happened. A tiny pause." McGill had heard that description before. Other pilots used the same words. Mushy. Sluggish. Slow to bite. They all assumed it was just how the Lightning handled in a hard turn. 2 weeks later, Benson did not come back. The mission report was familiar. Engaged by Zeros. Attempted to disengage in diving turn. Shot down while maneuvering. Probable pilot error. Pilot error. The phrase showed up in report after report like a rubber stamp. Then there was Captain Richard "Rick" Monroe. Monroe was not a rookie. He was a flight leader with a dozen kills. He understood his airplane's strengths and weaknesses better than most. The kind of pilot who did not make stupid mistakes. On an August morning patrol, Monroe's flight bounced a group of zeros. First pass, clean kill. Textbook stuff. On the second pass, 2 Japanese fighters flipped around on him. Monroe did exactly what doctrine said. Roll inverted. Pull through. Use speed to escape. Over the radio he was heard shouting that his controls felt heavy and late. His wingman watched Monroe try to roll away and saw the lightning respond just slowly enough for the zeros to stay with him. They rode him down, firing all the way, until Monroe hit the water in a sheet of spray. Again the paperwork blamed the men, not the machine. Pilot failed to disengage effectively. McGill heard the story standing beside a workbench covered in tools, trying to keep his hands from shaking. He had signed off Monroe's aircraft as fit for combat 12 hours earlier. Scene 3, the hidden problem. Most people looked at the lightning and saw engines, guns, and armor. McGill looked at something else. Control cables. Long runs of steel cable snaking through pulleys from the cockpit, out through the wing and into the ailerons that rolled the aircraft. Every turn, every snap roll, every bank started as a hand on a stick that pulled on those cables. And there was slack. Not much. Less than half an inch if you grabbed the cable in the inspection bay and tugged. The manual said it was acceptable. Factory tolerances. Within limits. To the officers, that was the end of the story. To a mechanic who lived with the machine every day, it was the beginning of one. McGill had a habit, a little bad science as he jokingly called it. Whenever he did a cable check he would pluck the cables with his fingers like guitar strings. Each one made a tone. Loose cables gave a dull, dead note. Tight cables gave a higher, sharper sound. Almost every lightning on their line sang the same off-key tune. Not dangerously loose. Just loose enough to feel wrong. He tried to raise it officially once. He told the engineering officer that there was too much play, that under combat loads that little bit of slack could become a dangerous delay. The answer came back in the language of bureaucracy. Within spec, Sergeant. These aircraft are built that way. You do not have authority to change control rigging beyond manual limits. You want to redesign the P-38, talk to Lockheed in California. 7,000 miles away. The officer was not being cruel. He was following procedure. The war machine was not built to listen to a sergeant with dirty hands and a gut feeling. So the reports kept saying, pilot error, and the funerals kept happening, and the beds in the tent rows kept going empty. By mid-August, McGill could list 17 pilots he had watched walk from briefing tent to aircraft, shake hands with their ground crew, smile for a moment, and never walk back. Scene 4, a desperate question. On a thick, hot evening, 3 days before the impossible turn over the jungle, Lieutenant Jack Harris walked into the maintenance area. He still had the look of someone fresh from the States. The flight jacket sat a little stiff on his shoulders. The tan line on his neck was new. He also had the haunted eyes of a man who had heard his friend die on the radio. Harris's wingman, Tom Kearney, had been caught in a turning fight over the bay. 2 zeros slid onto his tail and stayed there, trading scissors and reversals. Kearney was heard shouting, almost pleading, that his lightning would not turn with them. The transmission had ended in gunfire and a strangled yell. Harris had flown back alone. When the engines wound down on the ramp, he just sat in the cockpit for several minutes, hands frozen on the controls, before climbing down. Now he stood in front of McGill's workbench hours later, the floodlights buzzing, mosquitoes dancing in the glow. "Sergeant," he said quietly. "I know you are not supposed to mess with the controls. I know there are rules. But I am out of time for rules. Is there anything you can do to make that airplane roll faster?" It was not a complaint. It was a question from a man who had calculated his odds and found them close to zero. McGill looked at him. He saw his own kid brother in the set of the jaw. He saw the empty bunk that used to belong to Kearney. He saw the stack of pilot error reports in the admin tent. He heard himself say, "Come back in the morning. I will see what I can do." Scene 5, the night shift that changed a war. The maintenance area after midnight was a different world. The roar of engines had faded. The sun was gone. What remained was the clatter of distant generators, the whine of insects, the occasional thump of artillery somewhere far off. McGill worked with a single drop light hanging from a wing root. Moths bounced against the glass. Shadows shifted as the bulb swayed. He unbolted the access panel on Harris's left boom and pulled it free. The metal still held the day's heat. Inside, the aileron cable lay in its run of pulleys, a steel lifeline between pilot and wing. He wrapped his fingers around it and pulled. There it was. That little moment of slack before the cable bit and the aileron moved. Maybe 3/8 of an inch. Maybe less. On a workbench, nothing. At 300 miles per hour in a turning fight, the difference between staying ahead of a Zero's guns or drifting into its sights. In his tool roll sat a piece of spring steel wire he had saved from a wrecked aircraft. He had cut it off weeks earlier, thinking it might be useful someday. Tonight it was. He measured off a length roughly the span of his hand, snipped it, and started bending. It was hard work. The wire fought him. His palms slipped. On the second attempt the pliers skated and sliced his knuckle. Blood slid down his hand and dripped on the concrete. He wiped it on his coveralls and kept going. Slowly, the wire took shape. Not a perfect Z, not anything a design bureau would sketch, but a simple zigzag that could be inserted into the cable run and act like a crude tensioner. The principle was simple. Add just enough preload that the cable stayed tight at all times, without overstressing it. Simple to describe. Terrifying to install. Because what McGill was about to do was not maintenance. It was unsanctioned modification of a flight control system in a frontline war zone. If it failed in the air, Harris would not glide to a nice emergency landing. He would fall out of the sky with locked controls, and McGill's signature would be on the last inspection form. He slid himself partway into the boom, shoulder jammed against the structure. The edge of the opening bit into his arm. Sweat stuck his shirt to his back. The flashlight balanced awkwardly, throwing jumpy shadows into the confined space. He pulled the clevis pin from the cable end, and the small metal piece immediately slipped free and rattled deeper inside the structure. Perfect, he muttered, feeling around blindly until he found it by touch in the dust. He inserted the bent wire between cable and fitting, fought to line everything up, and hammered the pin back through with the handle of a wrench. When it finally seated, he gave the cable a hard pull. No slack. The aileron moved the moment he tugged. He exhaled for what felt like the first time in 20 minutes. The modification had taken less than 10 minutes of clock time and more than a year off his life. McGill reinstalled the access panel, scrubbed the worst of the blood off his hands at a leaky tap, packed his tools and stepped out into the thick night air. He did not sleep. He lay on his bunk staring at the canvas ceiling, counting possible failure modes. If he got it wrong, he would kill a man and probably face a court-martial. If he did nothing, Harris would die anyway, like Benson and Monroe and Kearney. Just before dawn, he made his peace with the choice. At sunrise he walked back to the flight line. Scene 6, 7 minutes over the jungle. Harris's squadron launched into a sky already streaked with thin high clouds. McGill watched his Lightning roll down the strip, props blurring, dust trailing behind the wheels until they lifted. The twin-boom silhouette climbed and joined 3 others in a climbing turn toward the coast. On the flight board, someone chalked the mission. Patrol. Possible interception. For the next hour, the airfield lived in a strange quiet. Ground crews loitered but did not wander far. Men smoked in silence. A couple of mechanics worked on a stubborn magneto just to keep their hands busy. At about 0815, the radio shack snapped to life. Japanese fighters. Multiple contacts over the Gulf. P-38s engaging. Above the coastline, Harris's 4-ship flight had found a string of Zeros cruising in loose formation, sunlight glinting off pale green wings. The section leader called for a bounce. They dived out of the sun, lightning noses pointed down, speed building. Harris fixed one trailing Zero in his gun sight. He pressed the trigger. The lightning shuddered as all 5 guns spat lead. Tracers reached out, but the Japanese pilot rolled away at the last second. A few rounds chewed at his fuselage, not enough to kill. The Zero snapped into a tight right turn and dropped into the thicker air below. Instinct took over. Harris yanked the stick and kicked rudder to follow. Normally, this was where the P-38 felt like it was wading through syrup. You moved the stick, waited an instant too long, and watched the nimble Japanese fighter slide away across your sight picture. This time, something different happened. The instant Harris rolled the stick, the aircraft rolled with him. No breath. No lag. The nose came around in one smooth, savage motion. The sight stayed pinned to the zero far longer than it ever had before. Harris squeezed the trigger again. A tight burst walked up the Zero's fuselage. Pieces flew from the wing root. Flames burst from the engine cowling. The aircraft rolled and plunged downward, trailing a black smear. Harris barely had time to process that he had scored his first kill when another voice yelled in his headphones. "Bandits high. 3 diving on you." He looked up. 3 more Zeros were dropping in a shallow dive. They had seen him blow apart their comrade. Now they were angling in for revenge. Even with its improved roll, the P-38 was not suddenly a Zero. Harris could not simply horizontal turn his way out of this. He shoved the throttles forward, trying to convert fear into speed. The Zeros were still coming. He did something none of his instructors would have recommended. He broke into them. He slammed the stick over and pulled hard, rolling directly toward the lead Japanese fighter. With the old, mushy controls, that maneuver would have been suicidal. The delay would have left him wallowing in front of 3 guns. Instead, the lightning snapped around like it had shed 1,000 pounds. The lead Zero pilot misjudged the timing badly. His mental picture of how long a P-38 took to roll was now wrong by a fraction of a second. It was enough. Harris's guns came on, and the Zero slid into his sight like it had been dragged there. A short, violent burst. The Japanese fighter lost a wing and tumbled. 2 Zeros left. They tried to outthink this new, sharper lightning, going into a scissors, reversing back and forth to force an overshoot. It was a dance they had perfected for months against American fighters that always seemed a little slow to answer the stick. Harris stayed in step. Every time they reversed, he rolled with them. The aircraft felt wired directly into his nervous system. 1 Zero flinched a fraction too hard, bled off too much speed. Harris cut inside his turn and fired at close range. The Japanese fighter shattered. The last Zero broke away and ran for clouds, no longer sure what kind of enemy he faced. When Harris turned his lightning toward home, he had 3 confirmed kills. Total time from first burst to last, about 7 minutes. Scene 7, what did you do to my aircraft? At 9:03 a.m., the sound of twin Allisons echoed over the trees. Men on the ground shaded their eyes as the returning P-38s approached. You could tell a lot by how they flew that last pattern. Tight, loose, missing. They counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4. All back. When Harris rolled to a stop on the matting and cut his engines, he sat in silence for a moment, just like after Kearney's death, but for very different reasons. His flight suit was soaking with sweat. His hands shook. This time his eyes were bright, not empty. He climbed down the ladder, saw McGill standing near the wing, and walked straight at him. He did not bother with a long explanation. It worked, he said. That was all. The story might have ended there, a private act between one mechanic and one pilot, if not for an observer. Another pilot, Captain Alan Mercer, had watched the fight from higher altitude while keeping cover. He saw Harris's lightning roll through maneuvers no lightning was supposed to perform that fast. He knew Harris. Decent stick, not a genius. What he saw below did not match the pilot he knew or the aircraft he thought he understood. Hours later, in the cramped debrief hut, when Harris talked about his 3 kills and kept repeating that his ship just responded different today, Mercer started pulling on the thread. He went looking for the men who had worked on that ship. Scene 8, the Whisper Campaign. Mercer found McGill at a bench, elbows deep in another P-38's wheel well. What did you do to Harris's plane? He asked directly. McGill hesitated just long enough for Mercer to know there was something. He could have lied. He could have shrugged it off as a fresh engine or good luck. Instead he decided that if he was going to get shot for this, he would at least aim the bullet in a useful direction. He explained the slack. The plucking of cables. The improvised tensioner. The risk. Mercer listened without interrupting. Then he did something crucial. He said, "Do the same to mine." That night McGill crawled into another boom, bent another piece of wire, cut his hands again. The next day Mercer came back from a sortie almost laughing in disbelief, telling anyone who would listen that his Lightning finally handled like a fighter, not a truck. Pilots talk, especially about anything that might keep them alive. By the end of the week, every tent in the squadron had at least one quiet conversation that started with, "Have you heard what McGill is doing to the aileron cables?" Not every crew chief wanted to risk it. Some refused flat out. "If the inspectors find this, I am finished," one said. Others looked at their pilots, looked at the casualty board, and decided the risk of a court-martial was better than the certainty of another empty bunk. McGill started teaching them. Take spring steel. Cut to hand length. Bend into a zigzag. Insert here. Add just enough tension. Check movement. Write nothing official. The modification spread like gossip. Airplane by airplane. Flight by flight. From one dusty airfield to another. No forms. No orders. Just quiet acts of disobedience carried out by men who were tired of watching pilot error bury their friends. Scene 9, the enemy starts to notice. By late August and into September, something strange began to show up in Japanese combat reports. Zero pilots who had spent months fighting P-38s with confidence now wrote about unusually quick American turns and improved roll rates. They tried their old tricks. Drag a P-38 into a flat turn, wait for it to wallow, cut inside, fire. Except now, sometimes, the heavy American fighter rolled and reversed faster than predicted. A maneuver that had worked dozens of times suddenly put the zero in someone's gun sight instead of the other way around. Experienced Japanese aces who had memorized the timing of American aircraft began misjudging by just enough to matter. The statistics shifted. In July, the Lightning units in that theater had been losing more aircraft to zeros than they destroyed. 2 P-38 losses for every zero claimed was not unusual. By September, in the groups where the illegal tensioners had quietly spread, that ratio moved closer and closer to even, then slowly tipped in favor of the Americans. Nobody in Tokyo knew why. They recovered a few crashed P-38s but did not see anything obvious. The engines were the same. The guns were the same. The overall design was unchanged. A bent wire tucked into a dark corner of a cable run looked like any other piece of hardware. You cannot adapt tactics easily against a modification you cannot see. Japanese command began advising pilots to avoid prolonged turning fights with P-38s unless they had a large numerical advantage. A small line in a small order, but psychologically huge. For 2 years, zero pilots had built their confidence on superior maneuverability. Now they had to wonder if that advantage still held. Some became cautious, breaking off attacks sooner. Others doubled down, overcommitting and dying faster. All of that because a handful of mechanics on the other side of the ocean had changed the feel of an airplane by fractions of a second. Scene 10, when the system catches up. No secret in war stays secret forever. Military systems are built to notice patterns, and somewhere in the paperwork jungle someone started seeing odd numbers. Inspection reports showed cable tensions that did not quite match factory averages. Some aircraft came in, perfectly within spec, one week and oddly tight the next, then back to normal when surprise inspections rolled through. One inspector at a New Guinea base got curious enough to look closer. He found a bent piece of wire tucked into a cable run. He pulled it out, held it up between finger and thumb, and wrote a report that climbed slowly up the chain of command. At first, the reaction was predictably bureaucratic. Who authorized this? Which regulation does it violate? Who can we blame? Punishing someone for improving performance sounds absurd, but organizations run on rules, and this little piece of piano wire had broken a lot of them. At the same time, combat officers were staring at their own numbers. Squadrons that had the mysterious, tight feel in their P-38s were coming home with more pilots alive and more Japanese kill markings on their noses. Dead pilots do not win arguments. Living ones who come home talking about how their controls finally bite when I need them, do. After some delay, Lockheed engineers were flown in to examine the field modifications. They measured tensions, ran stress calculations, and performed test flights. Their conclusion was awkward but clear. The mechanics were right. A small increase in cable preload reduced control lag and made the Lightning more responsive in combat maneuvers without creating unacceptable stress. In later production models and official maintenance bulletins, improved methods for keeping the control system tight appeared. In the neat language of engineering documents, the change was credited to analysis and testing. There was no line item for idea first implemented by a sleep-deprived sergeant in a muddy hangar at the edge of the jungle. Scene 11, after the shooting stops. The war ended. Pilots went home to farms, factories, and quiet suburbs. Some stayed in the new Air Force. Some never flew again. Many remembered the first time their Lightning answered the stick the way they had always wished it would. The day the turning fight felt different. The mission where they realized they might actually survive this tour. Lieutenant Jack Harris made it back to the States. He flew a total of more than 60 combat missions, finished the war as an ace with double-digit kills, married a woman who had written to him all through those jungle months, and spent decades flying crop dusters over the flat fields of his childhood state. Once a year, on the date of that first 3-kill mission, he picked up the phone and called a man in California. "Danny, it is Jack," he would say. "You still tightening those cables?" On the other end of the line, in a small automotive shop that smelled like oil and rubber instead of avgas and jungle rot, a middle-aged man with rough hands would laugh. "Just keeping them within spec, Lieutenant." Sergeant McGill did not stay in the service after 1946. He went back to civilian engines. Cars instead of Allisons. Carburetors instead of superchargers. If you had walked into his garage in the 1960s and asked about the war, he would have shrugged. "I fixed airplanes," he would say. The pilots did the hard part. He never got a medal for the tensioner. The official histories of the P-38s development mention many clever engineers and test pilots. His name sits, if at all, in faded maintenance logs that nobody reads. Years later, a researcher digging through those logs noticed repeated references to field cable tension modification, and started asking questions. Slowly, pieces of the story emerged from veterans' memories. How many lives that small change saved is hard to measure exactly. Some estimates suggest dozens. Others, 100 or more, based on improved survival rates in squadrons that used the modification. McGill himself refused to guess. "I remember the ones who came back and shook my hand," he said once. That is enough. When he died, his obituary in a local paper mentioned that he had been a World War II aircraft mechanic in the Pacific. It did not list, quietly altered the outcome of dogfights from New Guinea to the Philippines. In the back office of that same garage, a single black and white photograph hung in a cheap frame. A young man in stained coveralls, squinting into bright tropical light, leaning against the nose of a P-38 Lightning. Jungle in the background. A date scrawled on the back in fading ink. Scene 12, Why this story matters. What do we do with a story like this? In the official record, wars are moved by arrows on maps and decisions in marble offices. Heroes are often men with stars on their collars or confirmed kills by their names. But again and again, when you look closer at how things actually changed on the ground, you find people like McGill. Sergeants. Corporals. Line mechanics. Radar operators. Code clerks. People who saw a pattern nobody else saw, understood a machine or a process just a little more intimately than the manual allowed, and decided to fix a problem before the system caught up. Sometimes they were rewarded. Often they were ignored. Occasionally they were punished. Yet their fingerprints are quietly pressed into the history of every theater, every campaign. In this case, a few inches of wire, a little extra tension on a cable, turned an aircraft that was always a little late to the fight into one that could meet the zero half a second earlier. Half a second does not sound like much when you say it in a quiet room. In a dogfight at 300 miles per hour, half a second is the difference between a clean blue sky in your windshield or black smoke filling it. Between pilot error on a report and a pilot walking back to his tent. You have been watching War Era Records. If this story of an unsung mechanic and a lightning that finally learned to turn hit you the way it hits us, do two things for us before you go. Hit the like button. It tells the algorithm that these quieter stories from the war years are worth sharing. Subscribe to War Era Records and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next forgotten chapter, whether it is about tank crews in the Ardennes, radio operators in the Atlantic, or resistance fighters in occupied cities. And in the comments, tell us where you are watching from and if someone in your family ever worked behind the scenes, in a war or in any dangerous job. Pilots, drivers, medics, mechanics, cooks. Because at the end of the day, history is not only shaped by the people in the spotlight. It is held together by the ones in the shadows, tightening cables when nobody is looking.